Last episode, we dealt with Jeremiah 3 verses 6 and 7. There's something important we can learn from verse 6 that I didn't mention, hence this episode. Here's the verse. Again, this is from my translation. And Yahweh said to me in the days of Josiah the king, Do you see what she did, turncoat Israel? She went upon every high hill and beneath every spreading tree, and she prostituted there. If you read starting at chapter 2 verse 1, this verse seems to somewhat awkwardly pop out. You're reading along and things generally flow. You think, So Israel and Judah turned on Yahweh. Yahweh points out that he was nothing but good to them, but they departed from his ways and did wickedness anyway. The priests and rulers were corrupt. Judgment is coming on the land. The people claim to be blameless and think Yahweh's anger will turn from them, but in actuality, they just keep on sinning, so of course Yahweh isn't going to act like everything's okay. Then, suddenly it says, And Yahweh said to me in the days of Josiah the king. And then it goes on to say what Yahweh said to Jeremiah. What's this line about? Well, obviously, if everything leading up to this was also what Yahweh said to Jeremiah in the days of Josiah, presumably this line would have come before all of it. But the fact that this line shows up here lets us know that the preceding material probably did not come from the days of Josiah. So it marks a division between two sections, even though it's in the middle of a chapter. One lesson we can learn from this is that natural divisions in the text are not always marked by chapter divisions, which isn't really surprising given that chapter divisions were added many centuries later. But it also lets us know that Jeremiah is composed of different sections of originally separate material. The material preceding verse 6 was originally separate from the material in and following verse 6. There's actually a whole lot of evidence for this phenomenon. What I'm pointing out here in verse 6 is just an obvious example of a literary seam between two parts. If you start reading Jeremiah from the beginning, it's also apparent that there's a literary seam between chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 1 is all about Jeremiah's calling, his installment into prophetic office, while chapter 2 totally drops that subject and is quite clearly the beginning of some other composition that is largely a rebuke directed toward Jerusalem. Furthermore, there are actually two primary versions of the book of Jeremiah. I'm not talking about different translations, but two very different ancient versions. One is found in the Masoretic text and is the version found in most English Bibles. The other is preserved in the Greek Septuagint. I've included a link to an English translation of the Septuagint Jeremiah in the show notes. And there are actually Hebrew manuscripts corresponding to both versions that were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the main thing to know right now is that these two versions are actually very different from each other. The Masoretic version is about 1/8 longer than the Septuagint version, and the material that's shared between the two versions is arranged in different orders in each. What this indicates is that both versions are compilations of smaller chunks of originally separate source material. And when you read either version on its own, you can see that the internal evidence also supports this. You have stuff like the first phrase of Jeremiah 3:6 that I've already pointed out, but there's also the fact that there's a mix of material that's written in first person, claiming to be written by Jeremiah, like what we have in Jeremiah 1 verses 4 to 19, alongside other material that tells stories about Jeremiah in third person, like what we find in Jeremiah 26, for example. There's a whole lot more that could be said about this and why it's important. Maybe we'll get to that in future episodes. For now, though, it's important to simply be aware that this is the case. Knowing that what we currently have in the book of Jeremiah is not all one thing, and not all by one author, is really important. And it can help us to view each originally separate work within Jeremiah on its own merits. And we can then try to understand and evaluate each author individually, without assuming that each author is saying precisely the same thing as the others. I'm sure when you write something, you want people to understand it for what it is, rather than combining it with what someone else wrote and assume that you must agree with that other author. Isn't it only right to pay that same respect to the authors of the literary works that were eventually compiled into the book we call Jeremiah? If you haven't rated or reviewed the show yet, please do so. It'll only take a few minutes and it might help someone decide to listen. Thanks.